Hi, my name is Kenneth Knack, and I am author of Images of America, Forest Park. I was born and raised in Forest Park, and I'm very happy to be your tour guide today as we tour Concordia Cemetery. Concordia Cemetery is what I consider the oldest cemetery in Forest Park. The Jewish Waldheim has a sign that says 1870, but during my research for the book, I wasn't able to find any substantiating evidence to that fact. And Concordia Cemetery was opened in 1872 on land once owned by Ferdinand Haas. He also started Waldheim Cemetery and Forest Home Cemetery. Now, there's a lot more famous, internationally famous people in Forest Home Cemetery. Concordia is a Lutheran cemetery, whereas Forest Home was a non-sectarian cemetery. So any kind of religion could be buried in Forest Home. That's why you have the Haymarket anarchists there, along with Billy Sunday. Here in Concordia, you're going to find a lot more God-fearing people, um, local, locally famous people, businessmen, clergy, um, but there are a lot of spectacular monuments here in the cemetery. The oldest of these monuments can date back almost 150 years. So as we begin this tour, I always kind of warn everyone that the monuments have settled, that the ground has settled, and to be very careful. I encourage everyone to come out here and see these locations for themselves. Um, they're much more beautiful when you see them in person. But I caution you to be careful, watch your step, don't lean on any monuments, and also to be respectful of any of the graves that you come across. We're going to begin today's tour here in front of the administration building. This building is the second administration building for the cemetery. The first one was located about 500 feet to the west at Gale Street. This building was built in 1931 and is constructed of golden-hued Ohio sandstone. Um, we're going to begin our tour by heading to section 15, which is directly to the west of this. Here we find ourselves in the northwest section of section 15. This is the burial site of the Otto Reich family. The Reich family was one of many monument companies in Forest Park. They were located on Harrison and Des Plaines Avenue, across the street from where the 16-inch softball Hall of Fame is located today. Where they built was actually part of the Dunlop estate, and the Dunlops had acquired it through squatters' rights. Otto Reich was a village clerk for the village of Forest Park, and he was actually running a campaign for mayor when he died at the age of 50. His son Vernon actually became a mayor of Forest Park for 3 terms between the late 40s and the early 50s. The monument companies, the monument business in Forest Park was a big industry with all the cemeteries that were located here, as well as greenhouses and restaurants that catered to the mourners coming in from the city. Directly behind this, you'll see a group of large private mausoleums. And the very first one here belongs to Dr. Selma Colby. We'll get a little closer look at it. She actually received a patent on the design for that mausoleum. And you'll see that the front door features a bronze, a lady cast in bronze who is actually reaching for the doorknob. That is actually in section 1, and that's where we'll be heading next. Here in section 1, you'll find many different varieties of headstones. A lot of them are granite, marble, sandstone, and a lot of them have deteriorated over the years. Like I said, a lot of these are up to 150 years old. This here is an example of a technology that they called white bronze. It's actually made of zinc, and it was sandblasted to give the appearance of stone. These monuments have held up remarkably well, and you'll find several examples even in Forest Home Cemetery. This is one of the few that I know of that's in Concordia. And you can tell by it's kind of a bluish gray color to it, and if you tap on it, you can actually hear that it's made of metal. So these monuments have really withstood this test of time. They started making these back in about 1870, and this particular one is from the late 1800s and is remarkably well preserved. From here, we're going to take a walk a little bit northwest, still in section 1, and we have 2 more important grave sites to see over there. Also in section 1, we have the gravesite of Ingman Carlson. This is another very unique monument. You don't see too many trains that are engraved into the headstone. We don't have much information on Mr. Carlson except that he probably worked for the railroad. There's a much more pristine version of this in the Library of Congress. The photo was taken in 1986, so that was before a lot of the weathering took place. You also notice the finial is missing from the top. But it is a very unique monument and directly across from our last stop in section 1. So we'll head there now. We're stopping at the gravesite of Julius Heidenreich. He was a Civil War hero, and this is also one of the most unique mausoleums in the cemetery. I've never actually seen another one quite like it. He has a monument on the back side, which it seems to be an older monument, but then there's this mausoleum, which to me almost looks like a subway station. Whether or not it goes down and into the back, it's kind of hard to tell. He had a very interesting and harrowing experience that he related in 1912 about his Civil War experiences. He was a member of the U.S. Grant Post of the GAR and a color bearer in the Company K of the 5th Illinois Infantry Regiment of the Union Army, commanded by then Colonel Jefferson C. Davis, which is kind of a strange name for a Union commander. His regiment was sent west after it was formed late in the summer of 1861. These were his recollections of the battle. By the beginning of March 1862, we had gone on foot about 700 miles from Jefferson City, Missouri, and were headed into Arkansas at the rate of 20 miles a day, hot in pursuit of General Price's Confederate Army. We were 200 miles from our base of supplies. We were shoeless and in rags, and we lived on corn issued by the ear from the commissary. We caught up with General Price and had 3 days fighting with him. This was the Battle of Pea Ridge. The afternoon and night of March 6th, I helped build the defensive breastworks. The next afternoon, we were sent through an open field into the woods, and there saw soldiers partially concealed by a scrub oak thicket. They displayed the stars and stripes, but we suspected them. The order was given to advance, but to hold our fire until the fact that it was the enemy was beyond a doubt. Then we fired into them, and they returned fire. They were 10 to our 1. I fell in the first volley. 1 shot went through my forehead, 2 others, which I still carry, through my right arm and shoulder, and another through my left leg, and a 5th through my left side, and a 6th struck a needle case and tintype that I carried over my right breast, which knocked me over among the others who were left for dead and dying. What was left of our regiment fell back, and the rebels advanced, shooting into our rear. At my left lay a corporal wounded. A rebel plunged his bayonet through the man, who grasped the blade, called out to his wife and daughter, and died. The rebel was about to do the same to me when another stepped up and prevented him. This man gave me a drink of water from his canteen, washed the blood out of my eyes, straightened my wounded limbs, and took my revolver away. While he stooped over me, a heavy volley came from our army, and I saw a rebel commander fall from his horse. I lay there for 13 days without medical attention or anything to eat except soaked corn. Water was brought to me in a greasy haversack. The wounded comrades beside me were all silent, and just beyond my head there was a trench in which the dead were buried. Day by day I could hear the grave diggers at work and hear the bodies cast into the trench and the clods falling back again. This went on 6 feet from me, yet I saw nothing of it, for I could not move or turn my head. After 13 days, Samuel Pearsons of the 3rd Iowa Regiment found I was still alive. He picked me up and hauled me on the bare, hard bottom of an army wagon for 28 miles over the rocky roads to the hospital and Cassville Courthouse. And that was recalled by Mr. Heidenreich in the Gettysburg Times of June 1912. With that, concludes our tour of Section 1, and now we'll be heading over to Section 2. Here in Section 2, we come across another interesting gravestone. This is the monument erected to Captain Peter Peterson. He was from Denmark initially, and he had a long career as a captain on the Great Lakes. I'm going to relate a little story of his life. He was the master and half owner of the schooner, the Winnie Wing, one of the best known captains of the Great Lakes. He braved many of the worst storms during his career as captain, which showed his ability and skill in handling a vessel. At the age of 15, he became a sailor, sailing from Denmark on coast vessels of the Baltic Sea. In the winter of 1861, he took passage at Hamburg, Germany, on the ship the John Bertram, and set sail for New York. From there, he went to Chicago, arriving in March. At once, he began his career as a sailor on the Great Lakes during the season of 1862. He was on the schooner Three Bells, and in 1863 on the schooner Manitou, Walrus, and Marcone. In 1864, he went to New York, where he took passage on a steamer, Morning Star, going to Havana. From Havana down to New Orleans and back to New York. Later, he returned to Chicago, and in 1865 sailed on the schooner Triumph, which was lost at the North Pier during the early part of the season. For more than a quarter of a century, he commanded that ship with a record that would be difficult to surpass. The Winnie Wing was used to transport grain and lumber. In 1868, Captain Peterson married Miss Anna Miller, and to them 5 girls and 2 boys were born. Peter, the oldest son, became a bookkeeper. Thomas J. followed in his footsteps of his father, serving as a master of the Winnie Wing. Directly behind the monument, you'll see an open field, or it appears to be an open field. In the early years of the cemetery, they used those as term graves, which meant that they were kind of rented graves. There, a lot of the people buried there were buried in wooden boxes, and it was for people who didn't necessarily have money for a final resting place, so they kind of rented that area. A lot of the bodies still remain in that area because times changed. People never had enough money to rebury their loved ones in a different location. Most of the area is unmarked, though. They had cemetery maps, of course, but there's no markers in those sections. Our last stop in Section 2 has us visiting the gravesite of Captain Butterfield. This is what is considered a tree monument. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, they had a movement where a lot of people used the tree as a symbolism, with the broken limbs meaning that a family member had passed away. And there was actually fraternal organizations known as the Woodmen of America that utilized the tree stump monument style. Captain Butterfield was he served during the Great Chicago Fire, and was a hero for the Chicago Fire Department. Frank H. Butterfield was a pioneer fireman. He was born in Chicago January 26 of 1849. His father came to Chicago in 1828. Frank joined the Chicago Fire Department 150 plus years ago in November of 1869. He was assigned to Long John Engine Number 1 September 1st, 1871, barely a month before the Great Chicago Fire. His company lost their horses during the fire at Wells and Adams and had to pull their engine by hand to Clark and Jackson. After their engine was destroyed from rubble falling from the Grand Pacific Hotel, they found a canvas hose at the Little Palmer House Hotel and fought fires at Quincy and State Street and then Dearborn and Adams. After the water in the hydrants ran out, they wound up at the Washington Street and the river where they pumped water for 24 hours and then went to Michigan Avenue and Hubbard Court and pumped water into the mains for another 40 hours. Butterfield was promoted to assistant foreman on engine number 1 March 1st, 1872, then lieutenant in 1875 and captain in 1878. He had many harrowing experiences. Once he was run over by a Long John hose cart without breaking any bones. He was also rescued from inside the debris of the Globe Theater after being in there for nearly an hour. But on June 30th, 1881, his luck kind of ran out and he suffered a compound fracture of his right leg, and then on another occasion almost had his hand severed. All right, now we find ourselves in front of the pump house. This is one of the older buildings on the property, probably dating back to almost the origin of the cemetery. You can actually see the old hayloft above the doorway here. At one time, there's still some supports for a water tower. The cemetery has an irrigation system, and they would pull water directly from the Des Plaines River, and they used to use the water tower to pressurize the system. However, nowadays, this pump house is still in use. They have a couple wells that are inside, but now they have electric pumps that pressurize the system. Like I say, the river is directly behind here, and as I mentioned earlier, Ferdinand Haas once owned all the land from Roosevelt Road up to Madison Street. Well, first he started to try a dairy farm on the land, and he gave that up, and then he turned it into a picnic grove. Well, that was a very successful picnic grove. Ferdinand Haas had a small steamboat that would go up and down the Des Plaines River for his picnic guests. And as a high schooler, I used to always kind of look for the dock of the old White Fawn, as it was known. But I always looked between the Eisenhower and Roosevelt Road, forgetting that he owned all this land up to here. So it's quite possible that the dock for the White Fawn was somewhere in this vicinity. Back in high school, I once found a horseshoe on the west side of the river, but I didn't find any evidence of the dock. So it's still kind of a mystery as to where that dock was. But it's like I say, this building is still in use. It provides water for the irrigation system, so you really, they have warning signs to not drink the water, and that's the reason why, because it is coming from the Des Plaines River. Our next stop will be the historic chapel of Concordia Cemetery. Here we are in front of the Concordia Chapel. This chapel dates to approximately 1899, about the same time when the original entrance was built. The chapel is still in use today, and from what I understand, it can be split in half so they could have two different services. This might have been one of two buildings. Gary, the old superintendent, and I came across an old picture that had a building that looked just like this, but there was a pond and a windmill in the background, and judging by the ages of some of these monuments in the area, we don't think this was the same building. There might have been another building just like this, which would have been used as possibly a receiving vault. Receiving vaults were used back in the 1800s, early 1900s, when the ground was so frozen that they weren't able to bury somebody. They would have them in the receiving vault until the weather warmed and they were able to dig. or they would hold the body there until the relatives came from out of town in order to attend the services. Um, what's really kind of cool about this building is that this is the same stone work that what the original entrance was made of. There's a historical picture in my book, and you can tell just by the layout of the stones that it looked just like this, essentially. Unfortunately, the doors are locked and we can't gain entry into the chapel. Understand it basically looks like a regular little chapel with stained glass windows, and the current superintendent told me that they still use it, but only a few times a year when there's bad weather. They said that most families today prefer graveside services rather than having it in the chapel itself. From here, we travel on to our next section. Here we have the gravesite of the Gross family, specifically Hermann Gross. He was born in Germany on October 20th of 1872 and came to this country at age 4. He was a bookkeeper in 1900. On October 4th, 1907, Gross applied for a patent for a household iron, which he claimed ironed better than that of a flat iron, and it was granted in 1909. He helped make the first 100 machines by himself. He established a factory in an old bicycle repair shop out in Algonquin, which became the biggest enterprise in that town. By World War I, Herman was the president and general manager of the American Iron Machine Company located on North Michigan Avenue, which is located right across the street from where Michael Jordan's Steakhouse is today. He went on to apply for patents for ironing boards, ironing board cabinets, and a tumble dryer. He died at the age of 67 in 1939. Like I said before, Forest Home has a lot of internationally famous people. Concordia has more locally famous and more businessmen, clergy, God-fearing people. So this was the Gross family monument, and just to the maybe 20 feet away from here, there's another very interesting monument that I noticed when I was researching this, but I really don't know too much about it, but I just wanted to show it to you as a very interesting monument. Well, you're walking through the cemetery, you'll never know what you're going to come across. As I was researching the Gross family monument, I came across this interesting monument here. This is for the Wegner family, and you'll notice that there's faces that are actually carved into the monument itself. And one of the interesting things that what I thought was pretty interesting about it is the bottom two are staring at each other, and yet one of the faces is looking out rather than looking in like the other three faces. So don't know if that was some kind of family turmoil, or if it was maybe Mr. Glant paid for the monument and he wanted his full face shown. But it's kind of interesting, and you don't see too many with the faces actually carved into the stone. So like I say, as you're wandering through the cemetery, you'll often see very unique monuments, and this just happens to be one of the ones that I came across. There seems to be quite a bit of relations here, because you can see on these lower monuments it says Gansky, and I believe that the tall obelisk has the same name on there. So this group of people were probably related somehow through marriages or otherwise. But from here, we are going to move on to our next section, which is section 5, which is located directly across the street from here. Okay, here in section 5, we come across the gravesite of Gottlieb Amling. Gottlieb Amling was known as the father of florists. He came to America in 1850 from Germany. He was 87 years old when he died in 1918. He was a farmer by trade and became one of the first settlers of Maywood. In 1889, his son Albert, along with one of his brothers, opened a greenhouse in Maywood. Albert's sons Ernst and Paul would open a greenhouse in Des Plaines. Ernst bought land in Santa Ana, California, and opened greenhouses in California. Amling's Flowerland became one of the biggest names in the floral trade, and at one time had large showrooms in Melrose Park and in Forest Park. The Forest Park location was just outside of Forest Home Cemetery at Roosevelt and Des Plaines. The Melrose Park one was located on North Avenue, and for many years they had famously had a haunted house there. So the Amling's name itself has been associated with flowers and florists for many, many years. Particularly here in section 5, you'll notice that there are many graves with a draped urn on the top of them. It is thought that the urn stands for the fact that we will return to ash or dust, the state from which God created us. The meaning of the drape on the urn can mean many things to many people. To some it can mean sorrow, to others it's the passage from one existence to another. Here we find ourselves at the junction between the north section and the south section of Concordia Cemetery. This dividing line actually came into play in 1868 when the Chicago Great Western Railroad laid tracks through the cemetery. These tracks stayed in operation until 1968 when they merged with the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which is actually a little bit further north up by Lake Street. For a long time, this area was just left undeveloped, but it has since become part of the Illinois Prairie Path. People are able to ride their bikes from here all the way out to Aurora or Elgin. So it gets a lot of foot traffic coming through here. We'll continue our tour on the south side of the cemetery now and feature some of the other sections. This large black monument here commemorates one of the darkest moments in Chicago history, especially that for the Nagel family. Irwin, age 20, and his sister Margaret, age 17, died together on July 24th, 1915, a very dark day for the city of Chicago. On the side of this monument, there is an etching of the steamship Eastland. The worst disaster in Chicago history occurred on July 24th, 1915. 844 people died when the SS Eastland capsized in the Chicago River. Employees of the Western Electric Company, along with many of their families and friends, boarded the Eastland moored at its dock on the south bank of the Chicago River between LaSalle and Clark Streets. The passengers were to travel to Michigan City, Indiana, to attend the company's annual picnic. The vessel was top-heavy, and with a large crowd amassed on the port side railing of the top deck bidding farewell, the Eastland capsized, throwing many of its 2,500 passengers into the river while trapping numerous others underwater below deck. The women were encumbered by the heavy clothing that they wore back in those days. Some were actually dragged under by people struggling to survive themselves. Most of the employees were from Western Electric's Hawthorne Works plant in Cicero, Illinois. The plant's workforce was heavily concentrated in Germans, Poles, Bohemians, and Lithuanians. 22 entire families were lost in the disaster. Of the 844 victims, 139 were buried in Forest Park, 43 in Forest Home, 30 in Waldheim, and even 2 in the Jewish cemeteries. 64 victims were buried here in Concordia, mostly in sections 8, 9, 12, and 13 on the south end of the cemetery. The victims here range in age from William Razzo Jr., age 6, to Augusta Weiser, age 65, who died along with her granddaughter, Elizabeth Rackow, who was only age 8. Like I say, there was many victims of the Eastland disaster buried here in the cemetery. We'll go visit one more in this section on the opposite side, but you want to take a look at the etching here on the side of the monument. Here we are in the lower section of Section 8, and we're at another grave site for victims of the Eastland disaster. And actually, I have a little excerpt from the Chicago Tribune, dated July 30th, 1915. It states, "A man and a woman were taken out of the hold of the Eastland with arms around one another. They were later identified at the Armory morgue as Charles W. and Catherine Trogg, husband and wife, of 1703 Maplewood Avenue. Their two children, Evelyn, age 5, and Walter, age 3, were safe at home because their parents did not take them. Trogg was an employee of the Western Electric Company." And as I mentioned earlier, there's 64 victims of the Eastland disaster buried here in Concordia, and on many of the monuments and markers you will see the wording "Victim of the Eastland." And here's an example. Catherine and Charles gravestones are located right at my feet here. Here we find ourselves at the southernmost section of Concordia Cemetery. Off in the distance you'll see several cars zipping back and forth, and that is the Eisenhower Expressway, or 290 as it's called nowadays. Back when the cemetery was in its infancy, the Chicago Aurora in Elgin opened on August 25th, 1902, and ran between Waldheim and Concordia. An interesting thing about that was people who took the CA&E, as it was known, downtown, actually got stranded on July 3rd, 1957, when it ceased operations. The people who took the train into the city had no way to get back. Now the expressway itself was initially called the Congress Expressway, or the West Side Superhighway, and it was first proposed in 1940. But the war and a shortage of steel and other crucial supplies immediately after the war delayed the construction for nearly 2 decades. It was one of the greatest infrastructure projects in the city's history, involving the massive use of powers of eminent domain to level a large swath of railroads, industrial buildings, homes, and even parts of the cemeteries here, for a distance of 7 miles. Between 1948 and 1956, over 6,000 Chicago families lost their homes to the superhighway construction. In 1954, a 2.5 mile section of the expressway was opened, heading west from First Avenue and Maywood, and was already carrying 20,000 cars a day. It was estimated that when the entire project was finished, which was in 1956, the road would be carrying 120,000 cars a day from Chicago's lakefront out to the DuPage County line. At one time, the cemeteries almost abutted each other, except for the railroad, the railroad line that came through. So when they built the highway, it actually took them 2 years to relocate thousands of graves between the two cemeteries. About 1,800 here in Concordia, and then the rest in Waldheim Cemetery. We will continue heading east to section 11. One of the things you'll notice about Concordia Cemetery is that a lot of the graves face east. And there's potentially a good reason for that. Concordia is a Lutheran cemetery, whereas some of the other cemeteries in Forest Park are non-denominational, so the graves face in all different directions. According to the Bible, it says, as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Thus, for the Christian believer in the resurrection of the dead, placing the body facing east will allow the dead to see the second coming of Christ. And as you notice, most of these headstones in this section are all facing east. So I thought that was a little interesting side note, and now we'll visit a couple of war veterans. Among the many war veterans that are buried in Concordia, um, I'm at the gravesite of Elmer and his brother Walter. Um, Elmer, who lived at 232 Marengo, was a pharmacist's first mate during World War II. Hospital corpsmen assigned to Marine units made beach assaults with the Marines in every battle in the Pacific. Corpsmen also served on thousands of ships and submarines. Elmer took part in 3 invasions in the South Pacific. His brother Walter, who was a corporal, died in 1946 under tragic circumstances. In an accident at a power station at which he was working, he fell against a 4,000 volt feeder, and the power was knocked out to all of Elmhurst for an hour. At the time, he was only 25 years of age. Here we find ourselves in section 11A, the southeast corner of Concordia Cemetery. And here at the grave of Ida Block and Julius Block, although apparently Julius was not buried here because the date of his death is not inscribed on the stone, and he would be nearly 170 years old at this point. The reason why I like to stop here at Ida Block's grave is because if you look behind us, literally 300 feet away would have been the Forest Park amusement park. You would be staring up at a 76-foot tall roller coaster and the Shoot the Chutes. Beginning in 1905, the Lutheran congregations that they felt that the sanctity and the solemnity of the graveyard was endangered and disrespectful to those mourning their deceased relatives. The screams of the passengers on the roller coasters could be heard all the way to Jackson and Des Plaines. The park did open, and it remained open for 15 years between 1908 and 1922. So you can just imagine the music and the noise and the screams that were heard in this section. And if you look at many of the headstones in this section, very few of them date before 1922. So after the park closed is when they really started to utilize this section of the cemetery. Also right behind is the end of the Blue Line CTA station, and this is where they work on their train cars. But the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin used to come up along the back side of this and circle around the amusement park. So I could say this section was rarely used up until that point. We will continue the tour and finish up the south end of the cemetery. Here we have a gravesite of, you'll notice a familiar name. That's my last name here. This is actually the gravesite of my great-grand-uncle Charles and cousin Elmer. Actually, Elmer Knack at one time owned the Sinclair station at Roosevelt and Circle. There's a little picture of it in my book. But some of the people who were in Forest Park back in the 1950s, early 60s probably remember his gas station. It was said that he kind of resembled Pa Kettle from the old Mom Pa Kettle movies. A little bit further down the road, we have other family members of mine. I have upwards of 40 family members that are buried here in Concordia Cemetery. So I just wanted to stop and pay my respects to my family members here. So we'll take a little stroll a little bit further north. Here in section 9, you'll see a familiar name once again. This is actually a plot that contains 3 generations of my family. Otto Knack is my great-great-grandfather. My grandfather Walter and my father Richard are also buried at this site. So I have three generations buried here. I have a fourth generation, Augusta's parents, that are on the north side, and I'll show them their grave site to you a little bit later because we had the monument restored. And Otto's father is actually buried in Forest Home Cemetery. So I have quite a bit of family in this area, and that's why this cemetery means so much to me. Across the way from here, you'll see the gravesite of George Vogel, and we'll go visit him next. And here we come across the gravesite of George Dutch Vogel. George Dutch Vogel was a West Side bootlegger. Born in 1883, he was considered the last of the Prohibition beer barons. When he passed away at age 68 after suffering a heart attack at his Brown Lake home in Wisconsin. He was a convicted robber and was acquitted of the slaying of a detective sergeant. Vogel was identified as a pickpocket, and he claimed he shot the detective in self-defense. He was defended by the famous attorney Clarence Darrow. He was arrested in 1921 and charged his offense in a jewelry robbery, and in 1930 a warehouse that he owned was raided and 72 barrels of beer were confiscated. So not everybody apparently was all the God-fearing people, and George, he had a very interesting life. So actually this will conclude our tour of the south sections of Concordia Cemetery, and now we'll head back across the split to the north side. Hi, as I mentioned at my family's plot, my great-grandparents are buried there. This is the gravesite of my great-grandmother's parents, so my great-great-grandparents, the Guildhorns. They were Augusta's parents, and several years ago, a branch came off of one of these trees and knocked the obelisk off the base. So for several years, it was just laying on the side of the monument. Just this past year, I worked with Kirk, the superintendent of the cemetery, to reinstall the obelisk on top of the base. And we're in the process of restoring it, cleaning it, and maintaining it. They leveled the base and everything. You'll see that in the cemetery there are quite a few monuments, like I said earlier, that the ground has settled, and the monuments themselves are in a precarious situation. In this area, this is section 6, you'll see quite a large number of obelisks, and we're actually going to go see the largest one in the cemetery. It will be our next stop. Among the many obelisks in the Concordia Cemetery, this happens to be the largest obelisk of them all. Belongs to T.C. Denier. His name was Tragot C. Denier, and he was a well-known stone cutter contractor in Chicago. His office was on West 21st Street. He was born in Saxony, Prussia on April 19th of 1847, and he was one of 5 children, 4 sons and 1 daughter. He was born to a stone cutter. He emigrated to the United States in 1854 at age 7. He began working in various occupations, but with rather poor success. He next attended high school for nearly 2 years and then entered a business college, from which he graduated in November of 1865. And then he became a bookkeeper for a stone cut firm. By close attention outside of his clerical work, he soon mastered every detail of the cut stone business and was entrusted with some of the finest buildings in the city, which were erected prior to the fire. Among them was the residence of Marshall Field. Immediately succeeding the Great Fire of 1871, he started a business with George Robinson under the name of Denier and Robinson. They erected some of the very finest building blocks and residences of the city. His work was always strictly first class. He put down the very first stone sidewalk on State Street after the Great Fire, and he owned a third share in the Acme Bedford Stone Company. So that kind of explains why he was able to secure such a large monument. Um, I was actually told by employees of the cemetery that that is in fact the largest monument. There's some that appear to be larger, but apparently this is the largest monument in the cemetery. Our next stop will be around the corner. There's a rather ornate monument which is also in section 6 around the corner. This rather ornate monument actually belongs to the Steuven family. According to Dr. Orland's initial notes, he had listed this as stop as Clara Steuven. Clara Steuven was a Forest Park School nurse who retired in 1937 after serving for 11 years. She served as an Army nurse overseas during World War I. She lived in Oak Park when she died and apparently was never married. Her father, Dietrich, who is also listed on the monument, was a grocer. Why they have apparently such a ornate monument is kind of a mystery to this day, but some people kind of felt that it's Celtic in origin, but others seem to think it might have Viking or perhaps Norse influences. Here in Concordia, between sections 20 and 21 is an area known as Babyland. It's a particularly tragic area, as many of the infants that are buried here were often not even a year old when they died. It also leads me to a couple of rather tragic stories, both of which are buried in other sections of the cemetery, but I was unable to find their graves. Whether their stones have deteriorated to the point that they're no longer legible, or maybe they never even had a stone placed for them. The first story is that of Minnie Graff. Wilhelmine Minnie Graff was born in 1877. She was living at 126 Rubble Street in Chicago when she died at age 21 on September 27, 1898. In a most strange occurrence, her close friend, also known as Minnie, and Miss Minnie Blonsky, died upon her coffin. The two girls lived across the street from each other for 10 years. A year earlier, Graff, who was 3 years younger, caught a severe cold and developed consumption, which is tuberculosis. The elder Minnie would stop by after working all day in a tailor shop. As the younger Minnie grew weaker, so did the older girl. She appeared to be in shock when she was told that her best friend had died. At the wake, she went to a place to place flowers on her friend's casket and fell upon it. The other mourners thought she had fainted, but she was dead. Minnie Graff was buried here, but her dear friend was buried in nearby Waldheim the following week. Another tragic story of an infant belongs to that of little Dorrit Zietlow, who met a tragic early death at the hands of a 13-year-old boy who had kidnapped her and left her to die of exposure. It was a case that stunned and enraged people throughout the country. Dorrit was only 2.5 years old, and her funeral made headlines because of an estimated crowd of 10,000 curiosity seekers, mostly women, crowded outside the chapel at 3337 West North Avenue. 40 people a minute filed past her little coffin. A detail of 40 police officers were assigned to control the crowd. Dorrit was being raised by her grandmother, as her mother was institutionalized and considered an inmate of the Hospital for the Insane at nearby Dunning. Dorrit had been abducted from her front yard by George Rogalski, age 13, who had been released from the juvenile detention for a similar offense. According to the Tribune, Rogalski, 14, stripped the little blonde wisp of a girl and left her for 2 days with no food or water. I told her I would give her a nickel to buy candy if she would come with me. Then I led her away by the hand. Rogalski said he just wanted to look at her. The little girl was found 48 hours later at the abandoned ice house and died shortly thereafter of exposure and hunger. Her little casket was carried out by Boy Scouts in full uniform with frightened faces. There was a crowd already assembled here long before the funeral cortege arrived. A captain from the police department contributed $100 for her funeral. The boy wound up getting 10 years in Statesville prison. And from here, we will head to the vault works. Okay, just behind the Babyland section, along the east edge of the cemetery, you'll see the Altenheim. The Altenheim was a German old folks community. The main building was built in 1885, and it was basically a community unto itself. They had their own gardens, they had a chapel, they even have their own graveyard, which is located at the back section. This kind of goes to show you the extent of the German culture and the German population of the area at the time that the cemetery was constructed. And now I'm going to show you the vault works. Okay, on this site where you see the large praying hands, once stood 9 large greenhouses. They were 25 feet wide by 100 feet long. Besides growing plants for the cemetery, the sales of the flowers, which were mostly chrysanthemums, helped the cemetery as an additional source of income. Most of the cemeteries had their own greenhouses at the time, and additionally there were several floors located outside the cemeteries. Now, directly behind me, there's also the vault works. In 1907, Concordia began making its own concrete vaults. Some 27 years earlier, in 1880, at the young age of 18, Leo Haas, son of Ferdinand Haas, created the LG Haas Manufacturing Company to make concrete products, including the very first concrete burial vaults in the United States. Before that time, burial vaults were built of brick right in the graves at the cemeteries. Leo thought they should have covers and began building 2-piece concrete vaults, which became precursors to the Wilbert vaults that are still manufactured today. And in the background, you will also see the Concordia Mausoleum. Okay, and now as we reach the end of our tour, we stop in front of the Concordia Mausoleum as well as the caretaker's house, or the caretaker / superintendent. The superintendent of the cemetery lives in that home just behind me, and it was built at the same time that the administration building was built. The mausoleum itself was built in the 1970s. Although they had talked about building a mausoleum here as early as the 1940s, it wasn't until the 70s that it was built. So it kind of has that modern architectural look to it. Okay, we're going to conclude today's tour where we began it, and that is in front of the administration building. The administration building features a unique set of chimes. They used to ring the chimes every day. They no longer do so because the chimes are so old, but they do play them for every funeral that comes through. There's only one company in the United States that'll repair them, and they come out once a year to tune the mechanisms. The superintendent of the cemetery actually pointed out to me that an interesting fact, that the keystone of the building actually is dead center in line with the center of Keystone Avenue. Now, whether or not that was a coincidence or was planned that way, unsure, but it's a neat little fact. I just wanted to say thank you for tuning in today for the virtual cemetery tour. I encourage you all to come out and actually see these locations for yourself. Just some of the details on the headstones and the monuments, they're just incredible. And there's overwhelming natural beauty here. We've seen plenty of deer here today while we were filming, and it's just very peaceful and calming, and it's a very nice place to spend some time and to get to know the history of the cemetery and the history of Forest Park. And if for further reading, if you want to pick up a copy of my book, it's available on Amazon.com or at local bookstores. It's Images of America Forest Park. I will actually be conducting this tour in person, live in person, on June 28th. Um, Tickets could be purchased through the Historical Society. And I just wanted to say thank you again, and it's been a pleasure.